out, again, that idea of that fractal and that iteration, because I was making plates that were the size of that paper, of that patterned image, of those lattice images of those brain scans. And I would cut out stencils and drop them over top of the plate, so a different part of the print would print each time. So it would be the repetition of that plate, of that image, but it would be a different section of that image. And so it starts to, when you look at a number of these prints together, you start to see the pattern emerge from print to print, because you may start to make associations from one image to another. And then this brings me to some of my latest work. So again, I never really got away from the idea of the pendulum. I think I was pretty interested in patterning, and that idea of patterning in whatever way never really left me. So I started thinking about pendulums again, but this time I was thinking about Foucault's pendulum specifically, because that pendulum is what you see in a lot of science museums. And that is the one that you notice that really depicts the rotation of the Earth. So you're really thinking about space, or the space that you inhabit. And so I started taking patterns like that, creating my own patterns, and changing their context. So I'm working on logarithmic graph paper, taking this kind of so-called Earth's rotation, and changing the kind of space that it's in. Again, you can see the patterning of the rest of the drawing around it. So what kind of space is that? It's an extremely flat space. But if you think of the Earth's rotation, that's something, of course, that's not very flat. So I'm taking something that has a lot of space and condensing it into a very flat area. So I'm doing the opposite here. Up until now, I've been trying to take that two-dimensional surface and make something that appears as though it has multiple layers and is very wide. And now I'm taking something that starts as being very deep and very broad and very dense and collapsing it into just one flat surface. And so that's what I was doing with these. And again, it's the counting. The fact that the counting doesn't conform to a specific number, and it starts to create its own space. Is it a fantastical space? Is it a real space? And you have to try to determine what that space even is. And is it a space that you can even enter, because it is so flat? I've taken all that context away from what kind of space that could be.
Sorry, do you draw all things by your hand, or
Yes.
a program?
Yes.
You mean the hand, using just the hand ink and
Just pen and ink.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just really not.
Yeah,
and
I saw the small
circle. And I don't know, I'm sure there are way easier ways to do what I'm doing, because I feel like I have to draw everything maybe 3 times to get it the way I want it once. So I'll draw something on a piece of paper, and I'll draw a number of patterns on a piece of paper, and I'll draw with pencil, and I'll erase and I'll shift things around until I get it just right. But a lot of times it's not the pattern that I want in the end. So I'll put another piece of paper over top of it, and I'll trace the areas that I want to keep, get rid of the rest, and add a new drawing to it. Then usually by that second time I can move things around enough to get the drawing that I want, and then I trace that onto the graph paper. So I usually go through a number of iterations before I get to that one. Yeah. And so one of my friends who is not an artist said, well, wouldn't it be faster if you just drew it right the first time? And that would probably be true. That would probably save me a lot of time. So I thanked him for his insight. But as I've been talking, it's not necessarily the time that matters. Time is important, and I think that's why I count a lot of things, because in a way it's also marking time. But it's also the process too. It's the process of getting from point A to point B. So they do go through, so that all is hand-drawn and is quite laborious, and it takes a couple of iterations till it gets to that point. And then that takes me to my latest work that is in progress right now. And so now I've been looking at a lot of Isaac Newton's work, where he was building prisms. And so he was, reflecting light through the prism, refracting it back. And so building these, he built his own prism and worked on angles to get the color to move just right through it so it would reflect back as white. So he did a lot of work with that. Did a lot of work with color theory too, that most people don't know, that I thought was really interesting. So he focused a lot on color. Well, one of the things he did to experiment with color, which I found really fascinating, was that he actually stuck a stick in his eye, maybe a little bit more ambitious than more people would be, but he actually, you can see that diagram there, he would put a stick in between his eye and the socket and put pressure on the eyeball itself. You know, if you rub your eye too hard, you start to see shape, form, and color. Well, he was doing that same kind of thing based on where he would put the stick and how he would actually press on his eye. It would change how he saw color, and it would shift the variations of color that he was seeing. So even though that's quite a disturbing experiment, he got some fairly interesting results from it. So I ended up doing an experiment of my own, but instead of having a stick in my eye, I had a knife in my eye. And so I had eye surgery this summer, and so this is where things started. This actually is a drawing just of the depiction of a visual disturbance I had in my right eye. So that's what I saw when I looked through my right eye. And so these first two drawings I basically kept, I wanted them to look like those old-fashioned diagrams, kind of what we saw of the writings of Newton. So I wanted to have that old-fashioned kind of diagram look to them. But one of the things that was really interesting to me was that the idea of Newton, whenever he would put pressure on parts of his eye, how it would change the intensity of the color was really interesting, because I woke up partway through the surgery and I saw the most amazing colors that I'd ever seen before, and it was almost like looking at an abstract painting. And it was the most intense, most brightest, most beautiful colors I'd ever seen, better than I'd ever seen in reality, which was really pretty interesting. Not that I recommend anybody try it. But it was really quite an interesting experience, because based on what happens to the eye itself and how the eye actually functions does make a big difference in how that triggers the brain to see the colors. So that's what I have for you. So thank you.
Do you have any question for speaker?
It was year 2015 on your screen.
Mm-hmm.
It was Symbolic, and my question is, are the Jacobi elliptic functions engaged somehow in the process of creating, the patterns you showed to us? Jacobi elliptic functions.
So in this work you're talking about,
A little bit earlier.
or let's see.
Okay, and one before, please. Okay, so additional question. Who is this gentleman?
I'm not entirely certain. He was just in that picture that I found. I wonder if that's Foucault himself. I'm not sure.
I suspect that this is Jacobi, German mathematician.
Okay.
19th century.
Yeah.
Because his work about elliptic functions was motivated by Symbolic.
Mm-hmm.
So I got a feeling that that's key, and the functions he introduced are also in the background.
Oh, interesting. Well, yeah, I actually look at the mathematical equations at the same time that I look at the graphs. Because I try to be informed by both, not just visual. I try to understand the mathematical part of it as well as the visual part of it. And if I can incorporate the mathematics in some way, I like to do that so it doesn't come across as being just one-sided. But I like to look at both of them before I actually go ahead and make artwork.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
So, what's going to happen with all those colors you saw? Are you going to continue your work now using that new experience?
I think so. I don't feel like that series is quite finished yet, so I actually want to continue working on that a little bit longer. I'm not sure what will happen after that, though.
Are you going to use maths with it or just let it go?
That is a good question. For this series, with the color related to the eye, it's probably less, I would say it's less math related. It's more based on that experience. So this one is a little bit different than the other ones just because it isn't grounded necessarily in mathematics and equations, even though it relates to some other scientific phenomena. But this one happens to be a little bit more freer. And it probably will stay that way. Yes?
Do you find the research that you're engaging in right now to be more personal than the previous one related to mathematics because of your personal experience?
That's a good question. It's different, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's more personal. It's kind of strange. I think I felt, for a while, I felt kind of almost bad about my work because it wasn't entrenched in these deep personal things, that it was based a lot on mathematics, and I felt like there should be something deeper to it than that. And so anytime I do something that is considered maybe more personal, something that comes from a personal experience, it feels different. But I wouldn't say that I feel closer to it. I think just because I have so much interest in math, that is still such a driving passion, that alone makes it very personal, which I know that sounds weird to some of you guys. But to me, that alone makes it, that really does make it like a private experience for me. That would be much akin to a private experience like going through a surgery, but just having that kind of passion and that drive to do something still feels very close to the heart. So I don't see them as being that far from each other. They're just slightly, maybe just coming at it from, two different sides, getting at the same thing but from different directions, maybe.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Two questions about your logarithmic graph paper.
Yes.
I didn't understand how the logarithmic graph paper got in there. And if you're using logarithmic graph paper, can you get paper of sufficient quality that your work will last more than a year?
Those are good questions. Well, so to answer your first question, I'm actually not sure how. It wasn't a conscious decision to just say, I'm going to go out and look for logarithmic graph paper and I'm going to make a series of work on that. It was one of those things that just kind of happened. And it just made sense, even though the work isn't specifically sparked by logarithms or the paper specifically, but because there is that mathematical relationship, that made sense to me.
You just like the looks of it.
Yeah, I think it was more of an aesthetic choice with the kind of imageries that I was using juxtaposed over top of that background. In terms of archival, I'm starting to look for ways of creating that kind of a look on archival paper. I'm not sure how long these will last. I have a feeling they'll last for a little while, because that paper's been around for a while and hasn't disintegrated. So, but I am looking, because I'm actually looking to find very large logarithmic graph paper, and I might just have to make some on my own. And so in that case, I would have full control over the kind of paper that I'm printing it on. Yeah, Johnny.
I was curious about how did your training processes influence your conceptual choices? So were you using pretty much, I saw Hansels and Hitchings and others listed, so.
Well, you know, I think for the longest time I was the most comfortable with etching. And that's why I decided to eliminate them at that one point. Just eliminate etching altogether, because I felt like my work itself was becoming very predictable. And so that's also why I stopped painting, because it became very predictable. If I could see exactly what was happening right in front of me, I had full control over it. And having that full control, I would fall into the same habits over and over again. And it's one thing to know you have bad habits, and it's another thing to catch yourself when you're in the middle of making them. And so I felt like it was just too easy to make paintings. And it got to the point where I felt that way for using things like etching as well, because I felt I was so comfortable with it that I knew exactly what was going to happen when I made the work. And so so that almost became a predictable kind of process, though I think it helped me get to where I was, so I think it was okay for a while. But I think the good thing for me about changing the way I was working about using different techniques was because it was rare that I would use multiple processes in one piece. So I had to start to think of my work as a collage. And that's really how I think of my work as a collage. It's not just a print, it's layers, multitudes of layers of all kinds of different things. And not necessarily knowing how they would react to each other. You know, what happens if I print this first and then print this over top to obliterate it, and then I lay this over top. So there was a lot more things that I had no idea what was going to come out of it in the end. At the beginning, it was kind of trial and error just to see what worked and what didn't work. And so I felt like I had really become much more of a problem solver. I had to think a lot more deeply about things that made me much more aware of the kinds of things that the research was about and how to incorporate that into the print. So I felt like the subject matter and that conceptual and the process of making the work started to really tie themselves together a little bit better.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Do you have another question?
Yeah.
For me, I thought it was really, okay, so I have a few sort of associations. I don't have a specific question, but some things that were really interesting. I was really interested that you came at the end to kind of physiological experimentation with vision.
Mm-hmm.
Because already from the very beginning, I was really interested in, like in the first pieces you saw, you talked about how the presence of these equations in these artworks was sort of jarring. And it seemed like as you went on, you were kind of, and throughout, there's ways in which it seems like your work is sort of making illegible, like the symbolic value of, the figures and the forms that you're working with. So there's something really interesting for me about legibility, and it kind of, one way of framing the question would be, you said that at the beginning, it was like there was too much, it was reading as too mathy, and people didn't like that or something, like it didn't belong.
Yeah.
So is there kind of a threshold for, because you're still dealing with things later, but maybe there's something about, the an abstraction into just sort of visual form that's, I don't know, does this make any sense?
It does. I know.
About the threshold between like the visual form and the symbolic.
Yeah, and that's a good question. It's a really fine line, because at what point do you tip too far one direction, the other, where the piece maybe isn't that successful? And I think one of the things I started to think about, all these all these critiques from graduate school keep popping up into my head all these years later. Things that maybe didn't make sense at the time, you know, start to make sense later, or things that I was told at the time, and I thought, well, great, what am I supposed to do about that? You know, and not really know how to process it or deal with it. And when I was in grad school, it seemed that most of the faculty said, well, your work is too beautiful. And they meant it in a pejorative way, because the implication was that there's no thought behind your artwork. And whatever content you think you're getting across, you're not. And that just drove me absolutely nuts. And I thought, well, my work isn't beautiful, it's about all these things. And they said, well, that's great, but I don't get that. So I went on this mission to make like really just god-awful, ugly paintings. And that was like my mission in life, was to make something that people would look at and just say, oh God, what is that? And I could never actually do it. I could never make one that was just truly, absolutely hideous. And then after failed attempts of making really wretched paintings, which I don't know if that's a good or bad thing, I thought, well, maybe it doesn't really matter. And then I started to think about things. You know, if you talk to a mathematician and ask them why they like math, you rarely hear somebody say, well, I love math because I like sitting down and doing really, really hard equations. You know, they talk about the beauty in the math. They talk about the elegance behind it and the beauty of it. So I started to think about my work along those lines, where you may not necessarily have to understand it in those terms, but if you can find the beauty and the elegance and relate to it in some way, then that would be okay. And so I guess, yeah, I try to find that balance between some kind of elegance that can maybe draw somebody in, and then once they're drawn in, start to find more through the symbols and then interpret it in what way makes sense for them. But yeah, it's a hard line to kind of stand on.
On the other hand, it seems like another way of approaching why people like math. I remember some essay that Simone Weil wrote. Her brother was a mathematician. She found some deep connection between mathematics and prayer precisely because of the arduous meditative quality of sitting and thinking really hard about something for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess, you know, that's funny, because that would be maybe the other side of it, because I talk about when I count things, I count every little tedious tiny thing, and I think in my mind that that's something that's meditative and relaxing, but on the other hand, that's all I'm thinking about. So it's not that my mind is clear like they tell you in yoga to find your center and clear your mind, because my mind isn't clear. It's focused on all the tedious stuff, but yet there's something meditative about the tedium in all of that. So yeah, there is that side of it too. I agree with that.
Okay, for more questions, we have refreshments on the second floor, and then you can ask the Mari for more questions. And then actually Mari has her own website, and Mari Brukowski.com, right? And then you can enjoy actually more work of hers, like you see this from the screens, and then you can visit there, and then you can see a lot of her work, so like me. Okay? So then let us thank the Professor Brukowski.